All right. Well, good morning, everyone. We are so happy to have you here today. Very excited to see everybody joining. As people are joining, feel free to put where you're from and who you are in the chat. Also appreciate filling out the poll. Just lets us know who's here today. And we are very excited to have Dr. Ashley Stewart here again today for Truth, Trauma, and Equity-Informed Solutions. Do you want to say a little quick hi, Dr. Stewart?
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here and have the opportunity to return from the previous session. So really grateful to be here and excited to get started.
Very excited. So I think we'll let the poll keep rolling in as I know people are still joining, but we'll start with some of our introductions. My name is Christina Clayton. I am one of the co-directors of the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. We hope that you have heard of us before today, and if not, welcome. We always like to meet new friends, and we're always excited to have you here. We want to first start with our land acknowledgement. We are in a virtual space, but we always want to reflect on the lands on which we reside and acknowledge the ancestral homelands and traditional territories of Indigenous peoples who've been here since time immemorial. As you'll hear about, we're from Region 10, which actually has 272 federally recognized tribes. So it's very important to us that we just think about how to work for justice in those communities and think about the land on which you sit. And so we'll put native land as a resource if you want to look at that in the chat. But just thank you for your attention to those details. About the MHTTC network, we're a nationwide network. We've been going since late 2018 and funded from SAMHSA, or Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Our network includes 10 regional centers, a National American Indian Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and our network coordinating office. And these same networks exist for addiction and prevention using the same structure. We support resource development, dissemination, training, technical assistance, and workforce development in the field. And as I mentioned, we cover Region 10, which covers Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. Our specific Northwest Mental Health TTC has the same goals as the network, which is accelerate adoption of evidence-based practices and other practices. We don't want to only focus on those, but that is a focus. Heighten awareness, knowledge, and skills, foster alliances, and most importantly for, I imagine, all of you, free training and technical assistance. And so we do that through a variety of means, through live webinars that we archive and you can view later. We do learning communities, online courses you can do at your own pace. We have tip sheets and other products that we share. We do a podcast. So we have a lot of information. And though our area of focus for the network is evidence-based practices for psychosis, such as assertive community treatment or cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis, we train in a whole lot of things. We have a large school mental health supplement. We work on suicide prevention, peer support, trauma-informed approaches and equity issues, and more. So we're always excited to provide a variety of content. And sorry, I just skipped ahead on my slides here. I think that's about it. We also have a resource library and a newsletter. And so you'll learn about these kind of events through that. So you can sign up if you're interested. A little bit about language. Our network has supported having this slide at our events because we want to use affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language. We want to remain mindful of all the different perspectives that may come up in these events. We kindly ask that everyone, in the chat anyway, use language that's respectful, not judgmental, inclusive, and accepting of all the diversities and abilities and experiences that we have here. A little bit about logistics. So think you're used to Zoom probably by now after 2.5 years. You're muted, your video is off, it's being recorded. You can use the closed captioning. We will share the video recording and slides and other resources that are mentioned on how to obtain a certificate of attendance in a few weeks. If you have any technical issues, our wonderful staff, Gabrielle, is in the background making everything work. So if you have tech issues, you want to just share a greeting or a comment or observation to everyone, please feel free to use the chat. Questions, and I think Dr. Stewart, correct me if I'm wrong, you may answer them as you go along. You may save some for later. So if you have a specific content question, I think it's really helpful to put it in the Q&A because it kind of queues it up separately. So if she missed it or she wants to wait until she gets to a future point, it can kind of be queued up there. Okay. And I wanted to make sure, Gabriel, we've shared the poll results, and I think we can close out of that, at least on my end. So we'll do as many questions as we can and make sure we have time for presentation. Lastly, your feedback is really important to our work. So we are required by SAMHSA to do a very short survey. It literally takes maybe 1 to 2 minutes. But I do want to share, if you haven't taken an event in a couple of weeks, they changed how these personal codes at the beginning of the form and at the end are formatted. So it used to be 4 digits, now it's 12 digits. But honestly, pick whatever letters and numbers you're comfortable with. We just want your feedback. This isn't an ongoing event, so it's less important that you remember what that code is. Just pick something, however you want to fill it out. We just want your feedback. We share that with our presenters in an aggregate form. We look at it in an aggregate form, and it helps us keep the free training coming. And of course, SAMHSA funds us, but doesn't know specifically what we do at any specific event. Now to the good stuff. So Dr. Ashley Stewart received her PhD from the Ohio State University College of Social Work and her master's at Columbia University. Dr. Stewart is a race equity subject matter expert, trainer and curriculum development specialist at C4 Innovations. In this role, she provides technical assistance, training, and organizational support to national organizations, boards of directors, and behavioral health organizations on implementing anti-racist practices. She utilizes an equity-centered approach to ensure that diversity and inclusion efforts move forward and reduce harm to people marginalized by these systems. Her inclusion efforts, her work includes assessing the intersections of identity, structural oppression, wellness, and policy. In addition to the advanced study of the consequences and causes of identity-based oppression, Dr. Stewart supports implementing anti-oppressive practices and organizational, structural, programmatic, and interpersonal interventions. We're very happy to have you here again today. We had you here last week. It was fantastic. So now we'll have a little conversation. So Dr. Stewart, we are so happy you're back here to talk with us today. We spoke last time about equity in action, where we heard your tangible examples of equity, assessed readiness to change and engage in meaningful conversations about this, review common pitfalls, and reviewed what transformative change look like in practice. You shared the phrase for today's chat, truth, trauma, and equity-informed solutions. And I really appreciated that you started with the word truth. So can you share what the word truth means in this context, in this phrase for you, kind of discussing trauma and equity-informed solutions?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. So truth, so I've been training about trauma for a while, right? And talking about trauma-informed practices. And something that I found to be critically important to the work was to also get to the truth of it. A lot of times we'll talk about trauma as it relates to different forms of identity. There are a lot of truths that people are navigating with each and every day of their lives, truths that are passed down generation to generation, realities that we might be diminishing within our daily societal practices that are absolutely relevant and important to people as they think about trauma, as they think about reducing trauma and being able to create more equitable spaces, is to get to that truth, is to acknowledge those realities that people are living with. And so a big part of how I approach trauma-informed practices is to acknowledge what people are experiencing and stop trying to, navigate around it and not acknowledge the systemic and structural truths that people deal with on a day-to-day basis.
No, I think that's really important because wherever you are in this spectrum of awareness and knowledge, it seems, truth is up for debate sometimes. And it seems like we need to remind everyone, history and what's real. And even if you can't see it or you don't experience it, it's true for others. So I really appreciate that comment. So I also was struck by, we've been talking about being trauma informed for a while. And it's so important to infuse in our work at the individual level, organizational level, systemic level. You have been doing this a while. I was wondering, how do you see the term trauma informed evolve and our approaches evolving in the field in your career?
Yeah, I think when I initially started to do this work, it would only come up in the context of, you know, behavioral health or mental health. And now folks are starting to see the influence of that across multiple different spheres, acknowledging and honoring the fact that trauma is beyond the incident, but the way that it lives and exists in people's bodies and the way that it's experienced by individuals. So by narrowing in, you know, really not seeing the consequences of trauma in how people are showing up, how people are participating day to day, has been a shift that I've noticed in the field. People are understanding that the way that you supervise needs to be thoughtful and mindful of the way that people are experiencing trauma, the way that you engage with someone, the way that you introduce yourself. You know, there's so many different parts of people's lived experience that is tied to some aspect of their life that could be activating or encouraging people even that we're not tapping into or considering. And so as we talk about trauma more openly, I think it's creating more opportunities to recognize the importance of showing up and being mindful and thoughtful of our own actions and how they might influence other people.
Yeah, and it seems so common, you know, whatever field you're in, and even if you're not in the, you know, helping professions, you see what's in front of you, and it's easy to judge and make assumptions or tell a story about, you know, why this is happening without peeling back what could be decades or millennia of, you know, things that have been happening to people and communities. So thanks. I think that's really helpful. So as you mentioned, you have been doing this work for a while. You work with individuals, organizations, systems. You have academic experience, and you're training and doing consultation all the time. I was wondering, when you get requests for training or consultation, what is the most common request you get? And, you know, and as an equity specialist, someone who specializes in these topics, do you actually see something else when these requests come in, you know, meaning what are people actually suffering from and or truly needing when they come to you and ask you to help them?
Yeah, I think the response to this actually has been changing a lot lately. I think that the nature of the types of requests that I'm getting today or that we're getting today, very different than 5 years ago, are certainly shifting. One of the things that I think when initially folks are asking for is they're asking for strategies to do equity. They're looking for like a 5-step plan that's going to help equity exist within a space without the acknowledgement of the whole person, whole culture, whole system change that's also part of it. I think that also some of the things that I'm getting now, which I'm excited about in terms of the conversation, that people are asking that critical what's next question. A lot of places have made meaningful investments in doing trainings. They've learned about what institutional biases are. They've learned the different types of oppression. They've been doing training on some of the general context and terms around equity and authenticity. I mean, we've talked about it from so many different angles. And people feel empowered or they feel engaged. Maybe they feel disrupted by these conversations and then are wondering, okay, well, what do I do with that now? And the different types of conversations we're having is, what does the ripple effect of that advocacy look like? What does culture change look like? How do you begin to shift the conversation around change fatigue to make sustainable, authentic, concrete changes within an organization that lead to longstanding equity? I think people are more ready to make those shifts. And then there are also folks who think that they're ready to have those conversations, but really have skipped some of those foundational understanding of inequities to begin with. So it's really about being able to and willing to do the thorough assessment that's needed to see what the health of the organization is in terms of its preparedness to talk about trauma, to talk about trauma-informed practices, to talk about equity.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm thinking of, you know, I think since the murder of George Floyd, you know, certainly many in the field and not even just in the field, you know, want to uphold and do better. And it's, you know, it's unfortunate. It keeps taking, you know, people being killed to arise these changes, but it's happening. And at the same time, it seems like it's not a one-shot checklist, right? And so that's what I'm hearing you say too, is you can't just, throw in some changes or make a few adjustments or add a few items to your management strategy. It's longer than that. And it's how you do those things. It's not just you have an equity team, but how did you create an equity team, and what power does that really have in an agency, or what part do people really feel they have in this movement? So that's, it sounds very complex. And that's why we're so glad you're here today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. And thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Oh, absolutely. Well, thank you, Dr. Stewart, for this conversation. As always, we really appreciate your insights and your wisdom, and we'll hope to talk to you again soon. We'll let you take it away with your slides now. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And hello, everyone. How are you doing today? Let me know in the chat how you're feeling. Blessed. I'm happy to hear that. Excited. I'm excited. Feeling good. A little tired. Absolutely. That's all right. I'm going to bring some energy for you. Appreciative. Excited to be here. Hoping my folks are feeling tired. Hope you can get a nap later. I don't know. It's 2:00 here, so I'm about ready for a nap. It's a hot day in Portland. Yes, please stay cool. Like a survivor. I love that. Ready to learn. A little bleak. Yeah. A little hopeful and energized. I like it. That's important. I appreciate the transparency there too. I'm sure you're not alone in that sensation. Well, hello, everyone. If you were here last week, can you do me a favor and just drop some exclamation points in the chat? That's the way I know who's here last week. Quintus, good to see you. Me and Quinn hanging out all day. Hello again. Okay. All right. So there are a lot of folks who were here last week. If you were not, we are going to make you feel right caught up and jump right back into it. If you were here last week, I want you to kind of sit with what we talked about in the last time and see how it applies or how it feels connected to what we are talking about today. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. The first thing that I always love to mention to folk is that I have been teaching online for a very long time. So there is pretty much nothing that can happen in the chat that would be distracting to me. Trust me, a lot of things that I thought, I've said this many times before, and I'm always surprised. So probably something, but know that you can ask questions, chat, talk to one another, affirm one another, ask, clarifying questions. All of that in the chat is welcome. We also encourage the use of the QA just so that nothing gets lost in the space, but you are absolutely welcome to use the chat throughout. And in fact, I hope so. With 168 folk in the room, I do expect a high level engagement. So today we're going to be talking about truth, trauma, and equity informed solutions. And so this is really building on our conversation from last time. If you didn't get a chance to see it, it will be published. And so you'll be able to watch that. A little bit about me for folks who this is your first time joining this sequence of sessions. I am a social worker. I have been studying racism, institutionalized forms of identity-based oppression. That's what my main body of research is. So in solidarity with people who are providing direct service, I'm also doing some work to look at how organizations can be held accountable to reducing harm. So it's offering and examining all sides of the equation. I also am a mental health provider myself, and so I do have that direct experience. I have a lot of background in training and curriculum development. This is with universities, of course, and my background in higher ed, but this is also health organization, pharmaceutical companies, all different types of places have I had the beautiful, wonderful opportunity to engage these conversations. And then, of course, industrial organizational equity consulting is a big part of the work that I do. So it's help leadership with what's being tasked of them, which is how do you create an equitable work environment? So today, what did you get yourself into? We are going to define and provide tangible examples of intergenerational, insidious, historical, acculturative, and race-based trauma and stress. We're going to assess strategies towards addressing dominant norms that might prohibit change towards trauma-informed and equitable practices. We're going to reflect on the importance of equity and inclusion in trauma-informed practices, and then review the importance of authenticity in the workplace and culturally relevant services and strategies to begin to implement change. And then I wanted to add a little something based on some conversations had earlier today around emotional safety and like the regulation of the central nervous system in this conversation as well. So that's what we're going to do today. For those of you who are familiar with me, you've seen this list before. I'm going to go through it relatively quickly. These are best practices that I find in having equity-centered conversations. They're not only important for this session today, but I find that they are very useful for people when you're having the conversation in other spaces. I'm going to highlight a few of my favorite, but I would love it if you would type into the chat ones that stand out to you or ones that you particularly like. So the ones I'm going to highlight for us today is that it is a journey. We have a short amount of time together today, and so we'll leave with some additional questions, and that's part of the process. And I look forward to continuing to engage in the conversation and hope that you all do too. This is not the work that we take for others to do. It is work for all of us to do. It should not be siloed. It should not be treated as additive. When we're talking about being thoughtful about trauma-informed practices and equity, it's really important that it's something that we all occupy as an important part of our experience. I also want to acknowledge that revisiting is welcome. And what this means is that at 2:21 Eastern, when I'm talking about this, if right at the end at 3:10 Eastern, you have a question, I want you to know that you're able to come back to the slide. You're able to come back to the topics that you might have felt like you missed the opportunity to chime in on, because I want everyone to be able to participate fully and also have the important time to process, because we all process information differently. And then we cannot challenge what we cannot acknowledge. So we want to be able to name things, call things in so that we can address them. And then one more, if I could add, I like the accountability is kind. So sometimes when it comes to like call out culture, sometimes it can be felt or seen or experienced as like abrupt. And I want to begin to change the paradigm in the spaces that I'm in to say, well, what if accountability is kind? What if we're in these spaces because we want to reduce harm? And what if I'm able to call Ashley, myself in, or someone call me and say, I know that you're committed to this work. I wanted to let you know that this statement or the way that this was phrased might not have landed the way that you intended to, and for these reasons. That's a very kind gesture to me, because it assumes or it navigates from this space that I can, and am able to do better. And so by allowing me the chance to address it now, the responsibility, being accountable to ourselves, is on me then to make that change. But the accountability component of the person who calls me in is also a kind act as well. All right, so folks liked giving grace, accountability being kind, safe and brave space. Yes, the natural element of discomfort. Absolutely. We cannot challenge it. We cannot acknowledge. I also love to ask for clarification. Awesome. Comfort is no test of truth. Truth is often far from being comfortable. Yes. Yes, Randy. And so because we are talking about inclusion and equity, I'm just going to highlight this really quickly. So a lot of times when we do this work, we go from diversity, inclusion, and equity, and we start with diversity. We start with diversification at first. And then after we create diverse spaces, we are like, yeah, we're going to make this space inclusive with all these amazing diverse folk, which is true. Whenever there are diverse folk in the space, diverse lived experience in space, things tend to get exponentially better. We know this. There's a ton of research that supports it, and diverse perspectives and experiences literally help to increase innovation, success, metrics, everything good. And then we say once those diverse folks are included, then we'll move towards equity. And what we did in our last conversation is we talked about why it was so important to start with equity first. So would anyone mind sharing in the chat what you kind of took away with from that? Why is it so important to start with equity first? Give some folks some time to type it into the chat. Why is it important to start with equity first? Maybe for folks who hear with us for the first time, what might be some of the risks of starting with diversity before equity? If you start with equity, you can genuinely include people without the risk of harm, absolutely. So that if people are trying to bring in, so that the people we're trying to bring in have a supportive and affirming place to thrive. Yes, folk need access to what they need so that they can feel included and be their whole selves 100%. Yep, people need to be met where they are to have their needs met so that that trust is developed. Equity is the bedrock. By examining the gaps that exist and persist, we're able to really see and appreciate people in their truths. We're able to acknowledge the differences that people have had to navigate and are still navigating in order to occupy these spaces. And so if we don't start with equity, then what we're really doing is we're putting people at the forefront of the experience to be tokenized, to have to continue to change the environment around them in order to be able to be their most authentic, comfortable self. And that puts the responsibility on the folks who have that diverse lived experience, who experience systemic marginalization, to create this space of inclusion. When we start with equity, we acknowledge that disparities exist. We acknowledge that there are gaps. We acknowledge that we would like for people to be treated, with equality. But we must also first recognize and pay honor to the facts of life, which are that disparity exists and persists. Yeah. Equity better allows others and yourself to be open and communicate. Mm-hmm. Starting with diversity can lead to tokenism. Exactly. Yep. Equity is quite different than equality, and equity is a prerequisite. If we can't be real about what things folks are experiencing, equality is just so far from our reality. So we first work to make sure that spaces are equitable so that people, the diverse folk who are part of the community, can be included. Yes, help set the baseline of consideration. Mm-hmm. Yep. Eliminating gaps and obstacles. I love that. Alrighty. So as an example for how we will engage in this conversation as we go into a conversation of trauma, in the objectives, I let folks know that we're going to be talking about racial trauma. We're going to be talking about historical trauma. We're talking about insidious trauma, acculturative stress, and different racial identity trauma associated with the construct and identities around whiteness. And so I want us to think about racism as a baseline. What different ways do you see systemic racism show up in our society? What comes to mind? What are examples that come to mind of systemic racism? Redlining, absolutely. Housing. Mm-hmm. What else? Schooling, education, and staffing, human resources, mass incarceration, healthcare, mental health, incarceration, redlining, child welfare systems, medical sterilization, law enforcement, media, jobs and advancements, financials, maternal mortality, ideology, name a system, yes, racial profiling, sentencing, food and nutrition, political climate more broadly for different candidates, mortgages, and loans, stereotyping. Yep, law enforcement. Yes, yeah, linguistic systemic oppression, absolutely. Different ideas around income and classism, immigration policy, absolutely. We see racism exist in all of these different systemic ways. I even had someone say, can we find a system that, that where we don't see racism play a role? Voting rates and intellectual racism. So we can acknowledge that racism shows up if some folks think most or all systems, or whether you can just name a few. We acknowledge that systemic racism exists and it persists. And in order to get into a deeper level of conversation around systemic racism, we must talk about, well, what is race? Now, I'm not going to go into it as deeply as I would, because I did a session a while back. I think they put the links in there earlier on race and racism. But as a foundation, as a baseline, politics, as a foundational baseline, race is an ethnological human stratification system, right? There's no biological basis for race. There is definitely different cultural values that are associated with race. When we talk about race being a social construct, we're acknowledging that there are different ways that race plays a significant role in our lives, and different cultures experience race differently from a global perspective. When we talk about race as itself, it's invented. It's an ethological human stratification system. And race there led to racism, which was a chain of dehumanizing and traumatic events that continue to hinder human progress. Race was constructed off of faulty science and other practices that are really consequential for people in society. And so as we get into a conversation of trauma, the trauma of racism really begins to refer to the cumulative negative impact on individuals of color. And we're also going to lean into this conversation today about the trauma of racism and the impact that that has on white and white adjacent folk. And so when we talk about race and race as a social construct, what does that ring for you? What does that mean for folks in the space? Say that race is socially constructed. Oh yeah, ethnicity and language barriers being correlated to level of intelligence, huge. Okay. Folks are saying that it can be deconstructed. Someone made it up. It's created a social hierarchy. Biological fiction, but not a social fact, absolutely. So there are a lot of things in our society that are socially constructed. They're developed. Our ideas and notions about what they mean are based on how people interact with them. So in the same way that we talk about, I like to bring in the conversation about like white supremacist ideology or white supremacy. A lot of times when we talk about white supremacy, people think about the Klan. Yeah, that's a group of individuals who identify as white supremacists. But white supremacy is about the construct of whiteness and things that are closer in proximity to the construct of whiteness being seen as more ideal or supreme. And I think that's a really important framing for us to lean into and to talk about, because it helps us be able to see the ways that white supremacy perpetuates itself each and every day in our lives. What are the things that are culturally, linguistically, ideologically, phenotypically, et cetera, that are mostly closely aligned to the construct of whiteness that are seen as supreme or most ideal? And that's what we're going to be leaning into when we're talking about the constructs in our conversation today. And so I just wanted to kind of put that on the table. Yeah. When repetitive and unresolved, the psychological toll of racism can absolutely distress a person's ability to cope. And so we're going to talk about race-based traumatic stress and insidious trauma to start. So for folks who aren't familiar with the term race-based traumatic stress, race-based traumatic stress or racial trauma or race-based stress are described as experiences or situations that are emotionally painful, distressing. They overwhelm a person's ability to cope. It feels like a person being exposed or physically attacked or seeing a hate crime. Those are things that are potentially traumatizing events, acknowledging that trauma is how it's experienced in the body and not inherently the event, right? So if we're acknowledging that being physically attacked or exposed to a hate crime, we can acknowledge that as a traumatizing event. But what about the day-to-day ongoing chronic racial stressors? Well, those are also considered traumatically stressful events. Observing it, seeing it, whether it's happening to you or whether it's through bits of data that you're experiencing through folks who look like you, all of those things compound to be traumatically stressful. And so this is a really important notion to lean into, because when we think about race-based traumatic stress, we have to consider the day in, day out interactions that people have. In fact, there's really great research that examines neurobiology that shows that if someone is discriminated against, the parts of their brains light up as if someone physically attacked them. And so we know the consequentialness of this stress is not only around mental health, but it's around physical health and physiology, and all of it being interconnected. Now, race-related stress, sometimes referred to as race-based stress, is the emotional, physical, and psychological discomfort and pain that's associated with experiences with racism. Now, Robert Carter, who initiated the term race-based traumatic stress and developed the inventory to be able to assess it, was very intentional and thoughtful in his colleagues to not pathologize people who are experiencing race-based traumatic stress, but also to hold and maintain that same level of accountability to the systems that are perpetuating that type of harm onto communities. Similarly, this is true with the scholars who did work around insidious trauma. And a lot of the research around insidious trauma comes out of LGBTQ and trans scholarship. And insidious trauma refers to the ongoing negative experiences of living as a member of an oppressed group, acknowledging the role that oppression has on a person's overall well-being, right? That post-traumatic stress symptoms or post-traumatic responses can also be connected to someone's experience living with oppression. Careful not to pathologize people and not to stigmatize folk, and to also recognize and acknowledge those symptoms that are happening in relationship to the societal systems, people, individuals, work environments, etc., that are causing that harm, those systems that we talked about earlier. Yeah. Y'all follow me? Let me know if in the chat. I haven't seen any questions come through, so I just want to check in, make sure y'all still with me. Let's see, type yes. Okay, there we go. Thank you. Only Rebecca's with me? Okay. All right, good. Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that question. So can I talk a little bit more about what it means to pathologize, right? So we're going to go into this next phase, which really talks about how we treat this work. And when we think about treatment, we think about what we describe as the cause of it. Is the cause something that's internal? Is the cause something that is systemic? And so when we talk about pathologizing, we talk about how do we treat the symptoms? How do we describe the symptoms? And are we acknowledging the environment as a critical player in the reason why those symptoms are showing up? So that's what we're referring to. Talk about pathologizing. Now we want to lean into historical trauma. And a key feature of historical trauma, a lot of the amazing work in historical trauma comes out of Indigenous and Native studies. You have a lot of work coming from folks who are studying the enslavement of individuals and specifically the transatlantic slave trade. And then you also have a large group of the scholarship coming from folks who are examining the consequentialness of the Holocaust in contemporary time. And so the key feature of historical trauma is that the psychological, emotional consequences of trauma are experienced and transmitted generations to generations through physiological, environmental, and social pathways, resulting in intergenerational cycles of trauma response. So what does this look like in practice, or what does this look like today? We must begin to acknowledge that the historical trauma messages are being passed down through narratives from generation to generation, but they're also being passed down chemically, as well as within, genetically from generations to generation in stress response. So new epigenetic studies are looking at the transmission of that stress response from generations to generations, really bringing to the forefront how important understanding and talking about historical trauma is. These are the messages and the cultural dynamics that have been shifted when we look at, the ways that people were lied to, and children were taken from their families and told stories that weren't true. And sometimes folks say, well, Ashley, these are things that happened generations ago. But I remind folk of a 5-generation processing space. And particularly when we're thinking about mental health and we're thinking about supporting folks, messages that people have around mental health and their safety around mental health and talking about mental health 5 generations ago is not that long ago. That's someone's great grandparent telling them to withhold or not share how they're feeling or what they're thinking in fear of repercussions that happened and how people misused different health professions and the harmful diagnoses that we have now come to recognize and no longer utilize in our practice, but were very relevant for people 5 generations ago. And so what are the messages that would have been protectively passed down from generation to generation that we would still be seeing the impact of today as we try to navigate and support people in mental health care? That's a really dynamic conversation to lean into. And I would love for folks to share how you've seen that show up in your work, if you have at all, in the chat. Then there is a culture to stress. And this work really comes out of immigration and refugee research, huge bodies of important scholarship that looks at people's experiences immigrating. You have a culture to stress, which is the psychological impact of adaptation to a new culture. And sometimes this assimilation that folks are feeling feels quite forced, like folks have to relinquish some part of their identity to have safety, to be accepted, to have opportunities to grow, to have promotion opportunities, right? And these things are impacting people's well-being. There's an incongruence with their beliefs, values, and cultural norms into the country that they are being received into. And this form of stress can be triggered or lead to feelings of inferiority, otherness. Someone might have mentioned earlier discrimination around language barriers or language differences, as well as documentation status. Yeah. And so I see absolutely coming in the chat, people are sharing deception is a huge issue regarding social justice, right? Parents having to have the talk with their children is an example of the way that historical trauma is shared as a protective mechanism from generation to generation. Yes, students in universities experiencing acculturative stress, generational poverty, colorism, homelessness. These are all results of generational trauma. Absolutely, Dr. Cindy. Could acculturative stress also include what Native and Indigenous people have experienced? Absolutely, Terry. The forced assimilation, when we think about Native and Indigenous folks and that forced assimilation, the trauma that is associated with that, being forced, there's some aspect of acculturative stress that highlights that if someone does not adjust or navigate or find ways to code switch into the dominant culture, that they will not have success in that culture. So that in that way it's forced. And when we think about Native and Indigenous folk literally being physically forced, there's a lot of trauma there that we must acknowledge. And this is why I started this with truth. Because these are folks' truth. These are the truths of some of the folks in this room, and I want to honor and acknowledge that. Generational poverty, the truths around that. What about stress to maintain your culture Absolutely, Lorraine. That's a great point, right? What does it look like to try to hold on and to preserve your culture? That is stressful. And I remind folk that while we typically think of trauma as like this event, it's also the compounding of having to do that every single day of your life that is traumatically stressful. And so when we think about it in the context, or we think about it in the work, we really have to lean into that too. Yes. Yeah. Teaching people how to navigate different situations for their safety, responding to police, distrust of institutions that are passed down from generation to generation. Thank you. So someone shared to the host and panelists, and I'm hoping that you would be willing to share it with the whole group, but someone shares a link to a racial trauma scale to capture the truth of lived experience, right? And if not, hopefully we can share that link with the group. And thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you for sharing that with everyone. And a lot of times when we have this conversation about trauma and racial trauma and identity-based trauma, we rightfully acknowledge and create space for the experiences of folks who are experiencing the greatest extent of that marginalization, who are on the receiving end of this, of these different forms of oppression. We lean in thoughtfully and intentionally to say, let's help people who are experiencing oppression cope and heal. But the amazing thing about healing is that healing happens on all sides. And so the critical part of the conversation we want to lean into is also traumatic stress on racial construct. Now, I knew that I wouldn't have enough time to dive into it, so I left out some of the scholarship particular to mental health and behavioral health that looks at how oftentimes providers, particularly white providers, are taught to address these issues from a systemic level, which is absolutely appropriate in some circumstances. But it also is very relieving of the anxiety of having to be very current and present with the impact of whiteness on white people. And so a lot of scholars have been examining the importance of talking about the trauma of whiteness as it relates to white folk too. One, to acknowledge that when we engage in this reciprocity of healing, there's a critical conversation that says in order for the occurrence or the harm to stop happening, healing needs to happen. And so these are some of the ways that it shows up in the scholarship that talks about the impact of whiteness as a construct on white people, which includes the internalized superiority, the lack of safety and added pressure to also assimilate to misaligned cultural norms that are deemed as superior through the construct of whiteness, lack of sensitivity, dissociation from collective trauma, avoidance, deflection, and anxiety confronting issues. Stemming from trauma, right? Experiences with racism, perpetuating racism also means avoidance of family-rooted trauma and history that goes uncovered, unaddressed, deflective thinking about loved ones, family, familial tension. Right, this goes back just a few generations, and if not contemporarily, for people not wanting to talk about the perpetuation of racism, the consequentialness of that, and the fear and discomfort that shows up in white families about addressing that. There needs to be healing there for that to occur, for the conversation to be around how to heal from that perpetuation to also benefit folks of color or folks who are experiencing marginalization by ceasing that behavior being passed down from generation to generation. Difficulties navigating difficult or overwhelming thoughts about race, lack of adaptability, trouble navigating. And the scholar, who is a white person, describes the habitual ways of assuming power and agency, the inability to change, and the distorted imagination of the nature of racism. Again, messaging that's been passed down from generation to help folks create the dissonance that's associated with the violence of racism that was seen in a lot of white families, and that continues to be seen in a lot of white families. There's healing that needs to happen there for that cycle to stop. And then the physical and psychological health implications. There's important research showing that individuals who are inclined to have racist thoughts and behaviors have worse outcomes, both physically and psychologically. And so we want to lean into this conversation and lean into healing, because an important part of the work is to acknowledge that while we want to continue to create spaces for folks of color or folks with systemically marginalized identities to heal, we also want to stop the cause of what is requiring folks to have to continuously adapt and to heal and to be in a constant state of coping. How do we address it at all sides? Yeah, absolutely. Just looking, catching up on some of the comments. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so I want to lean into these examples about trauma a little differently now. We talked about systemic racism, but I want us to think about racism systemically. So tell me, what are this is a biology quiz for y'all. What are some of the systems in the body? Name some of the systems in the body for me. Nervous system, absolutely. Sympathetic, yes. Sympathetic, parasympathetic, lung, respiratory, skeletal. Cardiovascular, digestive, endocrine. Reproductive. We're my biology folk. Absolutely, right? You have all of these respiratory, exactly. We have all of these systems in the body too. Circulatory, integumentary, yes. We have all these systems in the body. Neurobiological. And racism impacts that too. And so just to bring this point home about what is the impact, because we're talking about this, about truth trauma and how to address the importance of addressing trauma in the context of equity, I want to use microaggressions as an example. And the reason why I use microaggressions is because a lot of times folks are really familiar with the term microaggressions, and this isn't the first time that people are hearing it. So because this is a web-based session, I know that folks have Google or Yahoo or whatever search engine you have available to you, and some folks might know it off the top of your head. No matter what you use, I want someone to put into the chat for me a definition of microaggressions. Thank you, Christina. So somebody go, or maybe you have a dictionary readily available, just drop a definition of microaggressions into the chat for me. Passive aggression and patterns of speech that work to decline a person's value. I love that definition, Jeffrey. Okay. Thank you. I have a chat here from someone who sent it directly to us. It says a statement, action, or incident regarded as an instance of indirect, subtle, unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group, such as a racial or ethnic minority. And then that definition gives the example of the collegiate campaign with students who were holding signs on campus talking about their experiences with microaggressions, which many of us remember that campaign, right? When someone expects you to behave in a certain way, not realizing how much pain they're causing. Absolutely. So I'm going to reread this definition. I knew that this was the definition that would come up. Thank you. Quite a few folks have sent that. These are the common or frequently used definitions of microaggressions. A statement, action, or incident regarded as an instance of indirect, subtle, unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group. Commonplace, daily, verbal, behavioral, environmental slights, intentional, unintentional, hostile, derogatory, negative attitudes. I want you all to look at these definitions on the screen and type the words that stand out to you as part of the definitions. What are some of the words that stand out to you? Subtle. Intentional or unintentional, commonplace. Yes. Unintentional, derogatory, daily, indirect, subtle, intentional, unintentional. Yep. Micro, action, attitude slates. Yes. So this definition of microaggression unconsciously, yes. This definition of microaggression, I think we really start to see this evolve in 2007 with the work of Dr. Daryl Wing Su. And Dr. Daryl Wing Su developed the taxonomy of microaggressions, saying that there were different types of microaggressions. Nonchalant, yes. You have the micro insult. Micro insult is, oh my goodness, you speak really good English. I didn't expect you to, right? Or, oh, you're very attractive for your age. Like, these are the things that are intended as compliments that aren't. For example, that's one, way of depicting it. Then you have micro invalidations, and micro invalidations are, no, I know Ashley, she didn't mean it like that. Like, she's not like that. I know that that's how you're taking it, but I think you're misreading it, as an example. And you have micro assaults, which are more like the things that we're able to observe, like people not putting money in your hand directly, or speaking to the person who's with you instead of to you directly. And these are the things that maybe are more observable: micro insults, micro assaults, micro invalidations, backhanded comments. Exactly. And so this really changed and shifted the way that we talk about microaggressions in a helpful way to make people understand it through the reality of different types of microaggressions that people could be experienced based on their identity. So this is 2007. Then it began to evolve. Now it's in the dictionary, and we're starting to see definitions like these emerge. But does anyone in the chat know when the term microaggressions was coined? Right, deliberately using incorrect pronouns is an assault. Absolutely. So the term microaggressions, yes, Quentin, absolutely. The term microaggressions shows up in scholarship in the late 1960s, early 1970s by a Black psychiatrist named Chester Pierce. And Chester Pierce first coined the term microaggression and defined it as the chief vehicle for pro-racist behaviors. Subtle, stunning, automatic, nonverbal exchanges that were put downs of Black people. And at the time, in the definition, it was by white people, since expanded to by offenders. Now, that's a very different definition than these. So how do we get to such a critical shift in the term microaggressions? And how do we see it continuously evolve and change to where we're describing it as something that's like, oh, unintentional, accidental microaggressions, right? That's a pretty significant difference in definition. And so we know what's going on in the 1960s, 1970s, a whole lot. You have a lot of critical conversations around the war, a lot of social movements, a lot of scholarship in the field of feminism. You have a lot that's happening. You have the Civil Rights Act of 1960s, the 1960 Civil Rights Act, right, Sandra? Absolutely. And so you have legislation that's outlawing overt racism at this time, which is leading to an increase of covert racism, AKA, I can't make you get out of my restaurant, but I'm going to make you feel so uncomfortable that you will. And the use of stigma, the use of bias, the use of all these other forms of oppression started to surface to put people down and to make people feel uncomfortable and to shift the way that racism showed up for folk. The term microaggression also comes out when there's this huge shift in the conversation about racism in general. We hear institutional racism and critical race theory starts to surface in the scholarship. Intersectionality becomes a prominent term at the time. And so there's something very unique that's happening when this shift occurs. And so microaggression wasn't intended to be described as something that was little. It was described to be the frequency of it happening, the consistency of it happening. And I like to describe, this is the way that I describe microaggressions. I think of microaggressions in terms of a scratch to wound analogy, similar to the 1,000 small cuts. If I come up to you and I scratch you in the arm, you're like, ouch, Ashley, why did you do that? And then I do it again. You might get annoyed at me. You might even snap at me at some point, but days go by, weeks go by, years go by, and I'm there just continuing to scratch the same spot over and over again. Eventually, this is going to turn into a wound. And a wound unresolved leads to Why? Because the bleed becomes infected, and might fester. And this is what we're seeing when we're talking about the consequences of microaggressions. If it continues to be scratched, it does not get the chance to heal. It just continues to show up over and over again. And that's the allostatic load that's happening, the overwhelming people's ability to cope, the burden of chronic stress on an individual, the consequences of subtle discrimination over and over again. That's what makes it a microaggression. Sometimes we describe microaggressions as that one offensive, derogatory thing that someone says to us, which is problematic, but that doesn't make it a microaggression. What makes it a microaggression is the repeated exposure day in and day out, demonstrating some suggestive inferiority in different places of your life. And so when we're talking about trauma, we cannot talk about it without acknowledging that what might seem small and subtle to us could be activating a whole wound for people. This is why it's so important when we're talking about trauma, we lean into truth. This is why it's so important when we talk about trauma, we start looking at the subtleties of institutional practices, the ways that you and I and other folk can begin to increase our awareness to reduce this level of harm, the energy depletion that's utilized by people code switching and changing and reposturing their bodies to avoid hateful, harmful violence in the workplace, in their doctor's office, in your care organization, right? In your school, wherever these spaces we're occupying. What is the way that this trauma is showing up for people in these subtle ways, living in people's bodies and looking for the opportunity for healing spaces? It's consequential to our overall health and wellness. Yeah. Self-value, personal perceptions, and basic understanding of self diminished. And it might even seem acceptable to you. And I mentioned that I wanted to take just a minute here to talk about the central nervous system and the importance of emotional safety. Neurobiological studies are showing us that emotional safety is essential to the body. It's an innate, inherent need that we have to be able to feel like our full, authentic self in the different spaces that we occupy. Emotional safety and the importance of relationships with your care providers, emotional safety in your personal life, emotional safety in the workplace, to show up and to be yourself and to be able to navigate through society with some level of authenticity is essential to our well-being. And when folks do not have the opportunity to engage in emotional safety, the activation that occurs in the central nervous system, activating people's sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight or flee or freeze reaction that people have, that literally feels like the anxiousness welling up inside of them, having to be hyper vigilant in the spaces that they're occupying. What can we do organizationally to name and address that? It can be as simple as acknowledging what people have gone through and what people are experiencing in life that can activate that parasympathetic system and let someone know it's consistent enough that this is a safe space for them to be their full selves with all of the different things that they've experienced in their lives. That's a place where we start to see healing. It's a really important space. Yes, Donna puts a good point to think about implicit bias in relation to microaggressions. Absolutely. And so I want to give just a few quick examples and leave some time for questions that folks may have. I don't see anything in the Q&A right now, but I'm sure once I stop talking, folks will have questions. And these are some of the ways that I want to lean into the importance of taking this information, thinking about trauma, implicit bias, the subtleties of traumatic stress as it relates to people's identities, and being able to apply it towards culture shift, ensuring that equity is integrated, being aware of the resistance to change and how that might influence trauma, and then also being mindful of ourselves. And so equity cannot be treated as an additive. If you were here last week, you're reminded of, I remind you of the equity pitfall chart that I showed. Equity is integrated. It's not an additive because change fatigue is very real. There's a high demand environment in the different places that you are working, right? Looking at the poll that you filled out when you first got here, y'all are doing really important work. You are working in essential areas of our society. And the environments that you are working in is high demand. And so when we try to incorporate trauma-informed equity practices, trauma-informed supervision, and sprinkle it in and not make it a meaningful part of the environment and of the culture, it does not feel safe for people who have experienced the most marginalization. We recognize the observance of stagnancy in these equity initiatives to keep the work going. This isn't the lane for one person. This is everyone's lane to do. And so when we start to think about what is our role, people tell me all the time, well, the issues feel so big. Well, there's also the reciprocal impact of advocacy. If you start changing the way that your group huddles in the morning to include equity, guess what's going to start to be the norm? To think about equity in the work that we're doing. And so it's not something that we just sprinkle on. It's a part of the culture and a normative part of our day-to-day practices. That's what's going to lead to culture shift. Assessing resistance to change. We want change, but change doesn't always feel that great, right? Change could require more of other people. Change could create some temporary or momentary forms of conflict or tension. Change can sometimes be positively overwhelming. There's a lot of reasons why people might be resistant to change. And resistance to change shouldn't always be interpreted as we shouldn't do it. It might mean that we need to continue to think about it more concretely. It might mean that we need to start thinking about how to incorporate people in the process more, being mindful where resistance is and being strategic about how to address it, not allowing it to deflect us from the work ahead. This is a really important and critical part of engaging with change and moving forward with change practices. And then last but not least, being mindful of ourselves, committing to being yourself is not only good for you, but it also creates that ripple effect of welcoming others to express themselves. When I talk about authenticity in the workplace, I'm always sure to not talk about our unique personality differences, which I think are always should be welcome. I'm not talking about the person who has to try to make sure that they don't use, their curse words at work or something like that. I'm talking about parts of your identity that feel like they need to be suppressed in order for you to be able to be yourself at work. This is what people are compromising in order to show up. And I think that it's really important that we lean into it so that there can be that mindfulness. Yes, someone says they like the mindful self because we like to think of ourselves as good people who treat others fairly. Realizing that we have said or done something insensitive can be threatening to our sense of self. So we must, yes, questions, thank you. So we must lean into that. There is the individual work to do, there is the structural work to do, and all of those levels are critically important to lean into. And in fact, if we recall about when we talked about equity pitfalls, just doing it at the individual level or just doing it at the structural level will itself begin to alienate the work instead of incorporating and recognizing that the self-work is essential for the structural work to happen. Yep, keeping that self-awareness is important. Absolutely. Yeah. So, Christina, do you want to introduce some of these questions that we have here?
Yeah. So, I know we could talk with you forever. It's such a pleasure to actually witness 2 of your webinars and how you interact with the audience. So it's really fantastic. So, of course, with 6 minutes to go, we have some really powerful questions. So one person asks, knowing the problem, how do we as Black people stop passing trauma down generation to generation? How do we move forward?
Yes, I appreciate this question. And I had a really dynamic conversation about this in a session that I had right before this. So I want to honor that conversation as I talk about this. I think one of the things that's important to acknowledge, and this person describes it, we as Black people, right? So acknowledging that they identify as a Black person, that they are a Black person. There is appropriate adaptation that occurs that that sometimes shows down in that passing down of generational trauma. So when we talk about race-based traumatic stress and historical trauma, a lot of times that shows up as intended to be protective mechanisms. Don't do this. Don't behave in this particular way. Be quiet. You know, those rigid parenting cultural norms. Don't be alert. Be aware. All of these things that people have to navigate and do as they occupy space as a person of color, as a Black person in society, has been passed down from generation to generation, exacerbating those feelings of trauma and stress and hypervigilance. However, it is appropriate adaptation, which is a term that comes from Dr. Joy DeGruy, or who is popularized by Dr. Joy DeGruy, who talks about the ways that has been historically a way to protect our children. To say that I know the realities of society, that if you don't behave in this space, or if you draw too much attention to yourself, you could be putting yourself at risk and at harm. And I think that sometimes it's easier to just put the parameters around safety instead of having the really difficult conversations about why, what that looks like, and how it's not fair, and how to navigate situations safely, and doing that healing process and that work. And so I wonder if we are framing it as like trauma generation to generation, as opposed to describing it as healing from generation to generation, being able to acknowledge why we are creating these safety mechanisms for our families.
That's interesting. I've heard that spoken in sort of Native community trainings as well. That yes, there are issues. Yes, there are traumas. Let's also remember our strengths, and kind of uphold that as we're talking about these generational things. But yeah, it's a really difficult position. I can't imagine. Do you see, so it's another question, do you see improving a sense of belonging as the right focus for organizations that want to increase their employees' or clients' emotional safety and reducing traumatic stress?
Do you see improving a sense of belonging as the right focus for organizations who want to increase their employees' or clients' emotional safety and reduce? I see that as an important part of it, right? Sense of belonging. Also, I think it's like, what is at the root of sense of belonging? What's at the root of sense of belonging is the actual belongingness, right? And so what does that mean that needs to happen in the culture for it to shift, for people to actually feel or be a valued part of the community? And so when people feel emotionally safe, they're able to be part of it. They're able to navigate the space without having to constantly adjust or hide parts of themselves in the work. They're freed up to be innovative and creative and aspirational in the work that they're doing, because they're expending less energy hiding themselves or adapting themselves to fit into the culture. So the culture would thereby need to shift first for that belongingness to be authentic, and for people to experience emotional safety and reducing traumatic stress. And so I think that that's a really great example of a interpersonal process that an organization can commit to increase belongingness, but also simultaneously working on that structural and organizational change too, to make sure that that can occur. And we do a lot of that work with people all the time. It's really dynamic.
Yeah. A shorter question, but just as pointed, is white guilt necessary in order for this to work?
Yeah, I think, I don't know what it is, so I can't ask for more clarity on it. But, I think that the question about is white guilt necessary is creating space for people to process their guilt necessary for the work. Absolutely. Those spaces need to be created. Guilt is not serving the function of creating systemic and structural change. So is it necessary for the work? Is the guilt necessary for the work? No, I don't think so. But I think places for people to process that guilt, to move beyond it, to get to the actionable change and the healing that needs to happen to stop perpetuating the harm, is absolutely necessary.
Okay, I'm actually going to type some answers as well, but in our last minute, because we're just going to let you go on till the very end. Are there any resources in a simple way that give practical ideas of how students can respond or address the microaggressions rather than just tolerating the toxic environment? School level students, practical tips. Yeah, I'll stop there and I'll type in some resources that I might head you in the right direction, but I want to hear what you want to say.
I would love for that individual, that person, and anyone else to reach out so we can talk about what that looks like, because we actually do a lot of that work where we engage with people around what are different practical things they can do to address it. It's a little bit more specific than a 5-point plan for people to do, but there are some really helpful public resources about how to respond to a microaggression. I think there's a lot of internal work that involves people understanding what's the best way for them to, which is where a lot of our work has shifted lately, is helping people understand how they advocate and what's the best type of advocacy for them. But to that specific question, being able to identify and respond to the microaggression is in itself a form of self-care for many people and absolutely essential. So yes. And I see a final question. Are there other trainings that are being provided in the future? I know that y'all are providing lots of trainings, so I will allow you all to share that.
We are always doing training. So thank you for asking. And if you're asking if Dr. Stewart will be back, well, you can bet I'm going to be hoping. So, because thank you so much, Dr. Stewart. I could tell everyone was just very moved by your content. I'm always moved by the content. And I'm just so grateful that you exist and that you're bringing to light not just your knowledge, but how you share it has really been really powerful. So thank you for all of that. I did put into the Q&A about the school stuff. We do have a lot of trainings and everyone is always welcome. I'll put this into the chat as well. But anyone is pretty much able to take any training from anywhere in the network. And so I'll put that, it's a little bit clunky, but you can look at the training event calendar. You can sort by different types or whatever. We're kind of wrapping up our final, grant year, but we'll be getting right back on the horse and getting new trainings coming. So we thank you for your time today. We thank you, Dr. Stewart. Thank you, everybody, for your wonderful comments. What a great way to interact in this virtual space, even though it's not faces and voices. So maybe we can do something more interactive next year, but just really thank you. Take care of yourselves. Thank you for spending time with us today. And we look forward to your feedback, however you make your personal code. So don't worry about that. Just tell us how you liked it, because we do want to hear how it went. So thank you, everybody. We'll leave the room open for just a few minutes so people can grab things from the chat if they like. And just a reminder, because I skipped our outro slides, we will have the recording, the slides, and any resources that Dr. Stewart mentioned on our product page. So yeah, those will be on the product page. So you'll get an email about that. And we'll see you soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.